And as you can see, you know, we're on a very rapid path of growth, especially when it comes to acquisitions. This presents a challenge for a lot of different reasons within our marketing organization because, of course, you know, we want to be able to tell a consistent story, but we have all of these different people, different technologies, and we have to bring them all together. And that's where the content team that I sit on really comes in. So, you know, Red Hat, as I mentioned, very open, very collaborative. We, you know, really thrive on the idea of transparency. And, you know, as a consequence of this, there isn't, I mean, obviously it's a hierarchy in one degree or another, but nonetheless, we really try to live the value of meritocracy and that great ideas can come from anywhere. And, you know, at this point in time, like all of the projects that we contribute to, it's up to 1 million open source software projects. And so, you know, we have a lot of developers who will contribute code, but we also work very closely with developers outside of our company. So relationships with those communities is incredibly important for us. In addition to which, being able to work with our different business units in a collaborative way and a non-confrontational way is really important too. However, governance is my middle name. And so working on the content team, I am often in a position where I have to, in a very gentle and persistent way, encourage people to adopt common standards and common language. So in the vein of that, I want to share with you a couple of analogies that I think of when I'm trying to explain this issue to people of how, you know, it's great that you're creating your own content. It's fantastic that, you know, you're willing to promote it. But in order for other people in the organization to understand it, promote it, be able to kind of seed it in the right areas, you need to be sort of very attuned to the fact that a common language is important, especially when we're talking about tagging, taxonomies, and organization of content. So these are two of my heroes. Egon the Ghostbuster is probably #1 on the list, has been for a very long time. And I will be talking about Neil deGrasse Tyson in just a couple of minutes. So one of the reasons that I love Egon is, you know, in his very fashionable manner, when he is introduced to a charming young lady, he explains that his hobby is collecting molds, spores, and fungus. Now, I am actually kind of similar. In my private life, I love to collect mushrooms. I'm really into natural taxonomy, which ultimately, when I came to Red Hat, and I said, oh, yes, I have experience with taxonomy, what I was thinking about was, you know, you identify something in the wild, and you put it in a genus and species, and this is sort of a hobby that I really enjoy. However, as I sort of progressed and developed in my role, I realized that fungi and mycelium, which is really the true fungal body, is very, very similar to a healthy content ecosystem. Because, you know, mushrooms are just the fruiting body of what is actually a very closely interrelated network of cells. It's very, very responsive to its environment. And I start to think of content in the same way, especially when we're trying to break down these silos and get people to collaboratively create and promote content. Now, if fungi are gross and you really don't like them, I don't blame you. It is definitely one of those hobbies that has gotten me into plenty of trouble with people who are like, this is just entirely too strange to be dealt with. If that is, you know, too repulsive of a concept for you, I also like to think of and describe content that is properly properly seeded, properly related within its content ecosystem as like a constellation. And so each piece of content has its own unique value. It has, an audience, obviously, that it speaks to. But one of the things that we really strive to do is to relate all these different pieces of content into sort of an overarching message and an overarching story. So that's another analogy that I like to think of. Or if you're into technology stuff, our content ecosystem, under ideal circumstances, is like a Gorse visualization. If you've never seen one of these, it's really super cool. It's basically a visualization of an open source software project being built. And so you can see all of the different users bouncing around, adding little nodes here and there, and tying things back together. And it's a slow and iterative process, as opposed to, you know, extremely linear front-to-back sort of development model. And so that's how we try to work with our content. That being said, it offers us some challenges. But you know what these analogies have in common is essentially we need to, in order to have decentralized growth in a nonlinear but iterative process, we really need common frameworks and common language. And that goes to taxonomy, that goes to tagging, that also goes to our organizational messaging and how we communicate not just with the world, but also with one another about the content that we have and the plans that we want to execute. So some of the challenges that at least Red Hat faces, and I think if you work in content, you probably have some of these issues as well. Governance and tracking are definitely really important for us. Being able to not just put our content out there and let it do its thing. It's really important to come back and evaluate and assess it. And the important thing about that is not so much looking at the traffic reports and looking at how many downloads you got, but a more nuanced understanding of like, how interesting was this to people? How well did we promote it? Because I've found in my work at Red Hat that some of our very, very best content that performs incredibly well was under-promoted. And so as a consequence of that, we have a reality where we have all this content that we can reuse or update or repurpose that we're not actually taking advantage of. Another thing that I've already spoken to a little bit is cross-team communication. When you're working in a very complex environment, being able to say, okay, this quarter we're going to be talking about X, and being able to agree, and not just agree on the terminology, but agree on what that really means and what kind of story you're trying to tell is very important. And of course, content goals. Who do you want it to go to? What are you trying to say to them? And in the case of Red Hat, a lot of what we're trying to do is establish trust, but we're also trying to tell a story where we're not just a Linux company. We have storage. We have all of these different technologies that we're trying to provide to people that can actually run an entire data center. And you could just use Red Hat as a vendor to run some very complex systems. But most people don't know that. And so we have this challenge of saying, who are we talking to? What are we talking to them about? So I'm going to just go through a couple of different things that we are doing and have been doing for quite some time to try to make sense of these organizational issues. First of all, making sense of your personas is really important. And I think this is something, a lot of you have heard a good bit about. In my personal experience, it's not just a matter of what issues they face, what kind of things they like to buy, what influencers they have, although those things are quite important. Understanding what influences and inspires them is really important. And so recently, our brand team started to do some research on our different personas. And we serve IT decision makers, we also serve developers, system administrators, and line of business leaders. And all of them have very different interests and very different things that, again, inspire them. I think also it's really important with a technology company or any company where you're talking to a more technical audience and you're also talking to the sort of high-level business audience, you have to understand that those people are motivated by different things, but they are interdependent on one another. Going back to my fungus metaphor, they are tied together in a common purpose, which is to be successful. And so, one of the things that we discovered kind of in the last, I would say, year or so, is that IT decision makers are the folks that we talk to most consistently. But the people who really influence those decision makers are more like this guy. They're the hacker in the basement. They're the person who's actually been interested in Red Hat since 1993. And they're the people who actually feel that open source culture is important for the world. And so being able to tell that story and tell it in a way that doesn't undermine the fact that we are a practical and secure solution is a really important thing that we've come to work on. Another thing that we've come to grips with and continue to articulate and iterate on is that a lot of our taxonomy, a lot of our messaging frameworks and ideas were based on the idea of like, here are the solutions that Red Hat has. And that's not really the right way to go. You have to flip it and you have to start to understand what are the challenges on a day-to-day basis that your personas face. And so, a lot of my work and other people on the content team's work in the last little while has been saying, okay, these are the different solution types we have. How do those actually map to the challenges that people have? And it's not a one-to-one ratio. And so we've started to develop a much more nuanced understanding of how we can communicate with people in a way that will relieve their stress, inspire them, and inspire their confidence. Another thing that we do internally that I think is really important is we talk about our voice. And we talk about our personality and who we really are. And we have a couple of different initiatives that have been really successful in terms of being able to communicate with all of our different stakeholders and business units about how we talk. So the content team has a great training. It's called Writing for Red Hat. And it goes through all of, it's not just a style guide, although it does cover some of that. It also breaks down the desire to talk in a very technological, crunchy way. We're really committed to the idea of walking our talk and talking simple. So we provide this training, but we also spend a lot of time talking about, like, who is the person that kind of represents the Red Hat voice? And, when I first joined the company, it was this guy. Maybe we're a little more like Neil deGrasse Tyson. And so I think it's really important to find a relatable human element to how you talk and how you communicate internally, especially when you're working with subject matter experts who are very high level. They really understand sort of the nuts and bolts of something very complex. But being able to bring it back to something that everyone can identify is really helpful, especially if you're distributing style guides or trying to get people to write in a certain way, edit their content in a certain way. It's really handy to be able to say, this is the voice that you should hear in your head. And if it sounds funny that that voice is saying the words that you're writing, then maybe you need to revisit that. Another thing that we have worked really hard on the content team to do is to form really strong relationships with our subject matter experts. We don't just rely on our product marketing managers to tell us what's important. And so we spend a lot of time networking with and trying to understand, especially because our subject matter experts, many of them are very active in the open source communities where we function. And so as a consequence, they're usually the folks that they have their ear to the ground. And oftentimes we will approach them and say, hey, we really need some content that is a little more enthusiastic and a little more impassioned than another white paper or an analyst paper that we're purchasing from a firm. So there's a particular SME that we work with very closely who really understands hybrid cloud, which is wonderful because a lot of the folks on our content team struggle with that concept. And so being able to reach out to him and have that relationship and say, okay, we very much want to understand when we're forming our content strategy, what do we ought to talk about? And it's really, really helpful. And I couldn't help, putting this picture of Smee from Peter Pan on this slide. Because, really, your SMEs are the folks who understand what makes the company important. And, it's incumbent upon content experts to really help them articulate that story and not to put the burden of writing on them necessarily and not to put the burden of promotion or understanding where these things should go. You should be able to relieve their stress about, where their content travels, but also reach into their brains and pluck out those really cool ideas that are sometimes difficult to come up with if you're more of a, writing and content strategy person. Another initiative that we've been pretty successful with is building an editorial calendar. This is something that I think is just a basic best practice and has really been very helpful to us because it gives us an opportunity to, share a lot of the information between the different business units that it ends up being very important. So, our editorial calendar includes a number of different components. We add events that we're staffing, events that are also just important in our industry because, we definitely have a lot of different events that we attend. And different business units, are really focused on telling a particular story at those events. And so being able to add that to our calendar is an important part of what we do. In addition to which, product and service launches, even these little dot releases are an opportunity for us to talk about how our technologies work together. And so being able to, and especially with Red Hat, we're really trying to pull together all of the technologies we provide and tell a consistent, coherent story. And it would surprise you how many people don't actually know about the release schedule of somebody else's work. And so having a centralized place where people can put that information is really helpful. And it kind of gives us, a quarterly look ahead of what's going to be happening. And as a consequence of this, we're able to sit down with our, web strategy folks, with UX, with our different, marketing leaders within the organization and come up with a quarterly theme that we're able to speak to. And so we'll look to a couple of important events that we're going to be at, or a couple of product launches, or even, upcoming news within the industry and say, okay, for this quarter, what we're going to focus on is open hybrid cloud or automation or one of these things that we want to be able to consistently speak about as a company. And that's been really helpful to us because we have, more than one web property. We have a lot of different sort of irons in the fire with our, email nurture and events we staff and different marketing initiatives. And being able to say, okay, we have our news, we have our events, we understand generally what's going to be happening in the next quarter. Let's find something that we can all talk about at the same time in relationship to those things. Another thing that, I think this is sort of always an ongoing process of using data to understand your content. So, we start with the basics. We do our traffic data. We look at, not just page views, but we look at visits and returning visitors. We're also doing a good bit of stuff in pathing analysis and understanding how people navigate through our site. In addition to which, one of our great objectives that we're starting to see in bits and pieces of our analytics is what kind of content people look at before we actually register them and identify them. And that's really helpful, especially if you're trying to demonstrate, to leadership that content has value and top of funnel content has value. Being able to say, okay, this individual ended up registering, they ended up becoming, an important account for us or renewing an important subscription with us. And these are sort of the top of funnel content that they interacted with. So that, sort of deeper and richer understanding of your data can be really, really helpful. In addition to which, we study our user interactions. So, we'll sort of understand which our most popular pieces of content or web pages are, and then we look at different heat maps and understand, from a UX perspective, where we can place things. We do a lot of A/B testing with that as well, which has been incredibly helpful to see how people's attention travels across and down our pages, and, just fixing day-to-day UX mistakes and being able to say with, a great deal of comfort, oh, we screwed it up. The main CTA is below the fold. Well, we need to move that above the fold. So, a lot of that kind of information can be very helpful if you're trying to optimize your pages. In addition to which, I spend a good bit of time looking at internal content use. One of the things that happens at Red Hat and a lot of other companies is that from time to time, we'll have a product name change. And, the product marketing manager is like, oh my God, we have 7,000 pieces of collateral, and we need to change the name on every single one of them. And I'm like, hold up. Let's look and see who is actually using this within the sales organization. Let's see who is using it in our email nurture and content syndication programs. And if it's not being used in those contexts, and it's not popular on our website, we could put a little disclaimer, this product formerly known as X, on your landing page. And that will save you money, that will save you time, and that also saves a lot of stress. And so we really try to focus our efforts on those things that are performing the best externally and internally, because there's nothing more frustrating than spending weeks and weeks just to drop a word out of a product name for a bunch of content that no one's looked at in 6 months.